This is the Rebel Author Podcast, where we talk about books, business, and occasionally bad words. Hello Rebels, and welcome to episode 258 of the Rebel Author Podcast. Today I'm talking to Daniel Kraus, and we're talking all about writing horror, voice, and what it's like to co-write with an estate, meaning that your co-author has passed away. First, to a couple of comments. One on Helen Glynn Jones's episode, which was What a Legend, and then Cassie commented on the Black Heron 24. Loved it. I always feel like I'm there with you two, and now like in the same room. So fun that you invite us to hang out with you. Aw, I love that. And it's funny because that's what I really love when it's like a two-person podcast, is it does feel like you're kind of eavesdropping over a fireside conversation. So I'm glad that you guys love it too. So in personal news and updates then, I am back from Sweden, which was the Stockholm Writers' Festival, and it was a lovely, intimate, really super friendly conference. It definitely felt like it was organised by an extrovert, which we kind of had a giggle about. She also admittedly says that she's an extrovert, so it was quite funny. She's actually hilarious. But yeah, for me as an introvert, there were a couple of points in the conference where I learnt about me and sort of where my line and tolerance is. So we had to do a round robin where I was on the table and there were sort of 10 new to me people, and then they would ask me questions for 20 minutes, and then a bell would ring and we'd move around and we'd do it again and again and again. So we did 4 rounds of this, and I was absolutely mashed afterwards. But just because of the way the schedule was, I didn't have a break and I had to go straight into teaching an hour and 20-minute class. So it was extremely intense, and by the end of that I was slurring my words because I was just I had no energy left. And I think it's also representative of the fact that I might have been away for 3 weeks, but I don't think that my energy levels are quite back to where they should be necessarily, and that is something for me to pay attention to and to be aware of, and to maybe think about how I can generate energy pennies at home, because I don't feel fully like recouped, I suppose. I'm not feeling like on the verge of burnout like I was, but doing an intense weekend like that, bear in mind I had taught another 3 hours worth of classes and also been on a panel for an hour. I just think like it was too much extroverting for me. But nonetheless, I thoroughly enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed the topics, I enjoyed the people, I enjoyed the conference, I enjoyed the place. So it was a wonderful weekend. But no more conferences now until Vegas. And then next year, I think I'm going to pull back quite significantly. I will have done 7 by the end of this year, and it is too much. I think maybe you can hear in my voice, I'm still not really recovered from all the talking. I'm just done. I want to stay at home and write books and read books for a while. So yeah, okay. And on that note, I am now back until Vegas, which is November. So in terms of the projects that I'm working on, I need to finish writing the next book, which is book 3 in my vampire trilogy, and prepare the Kickstarter. Obviously, I'm working with the amazing Petra, who is project managing it for me, and she will be on the show, I believe on the 25th of September, to talk all about project managing Kickstarters and what it's like, and all the cool stuff that we do and how we've kind of got to where we are. And so, yeah, we are, obviously she's doing most of the work. I'm just the pretty face. Kidding. But you know what I mean. So we are working together on that. I've got to do some promo stuff for that. And I need to finish the I need to finish the books first for our next Patreon masterclass, which is on writing spice, both sweet and dirty. And that class is going to be on the, what is it? It is on the 18th of September. And so I'm finishing that, and I think that's about it really. I've just about decided what my next series is going to be, so I am looking and hunting for books for that, and also doing all the market research. It's like my happy place. Other than drafting, I think market research is my happy place, not least because I get to buy a load of books, but also because I get to be nosy and see what's going on in the market. So yeah, I busy as always, but very, very excited to be back at the desk. I just want to start working. I'm struggling a little bit because childcare fell through this week, so I'm not really going to be back at the desk properly until Tuesday, I don't think, which is going to put me 3 days behind on my words. Yay! And I really, I put it later. I put a later start as well. So I'm a little bit frustrated about that because I kind of thought naively that I'd be writing again come Monday. And then I realised Monday was bank holiday. So I was like, okay, fine, we'll write on Tuesday. No. Still not writing. Probably not going to be writing till next week. So, yeah. Hopefully next week I will be back to words and loving life again. All right. The Rebel of the Week this week is MJ. MJ says, I used to be an instructor at an outdoor activity centre. I won't say the name. One of the sessions I used to lead was rifle shooting. They were lead pellets, so a lot safer for children to use, not real guns. I usually taught children over the age of 11, which was good because they were big enough to hold the rifles, and majority of them, with my teaching, could pick it up easily and hit the target, which they got to take home with them. But on occasion, I was asked to take a group of 7-year-olds. We had a few huts and there were 2 groups total. There was only one teacher with the whole group and they opted to join the other instructor, leaving me to take a group of 10 kids to teach solo. Holy shit. Which, don't get me wrong, they were super well behaved, so I didn't feel like I needed the teacher for help. The only issue was these kids were so small. They struggled to hold the rifles, but also could not hit the target to save their lives. I felt so bad because they were so enthusiastic and listened so well to all the safety instructions. When you hit the target, it would make a noise of like metal hitting metal. So I decided to be sneaky and took it on myself to stand behind the kids and using my own rifles, safely of course, I would shoot their targets for them without realising. Oh, that's so cute. I would time it for when they would shoot their own rifle and try to do it at the same moment so they never noticed. They were so happy when they got their target papers back to take home. All the kids were so pleased they had put a couple of holes in their targets. I was also pleased with myself until we met up with the group from the other hut. Those kids were not looking too impressed with their targets that didn't have any holes in. My group were happy and bragging about how well they'd done. I'm pretty sure the teacher either wised up to what I had done or just thought I was the most amazing instructor ever because she never questioned it. I never told anyone but the other instructor. I never told anyone, but the other instructor didn't look too happy about it. Not sure if he was mad thinking I was better or that he didn't have the same idea. And MJ has put a picture of the rifle shooting sent it to us, so I'll ask whether or not we're allowed to share that in the show notes, but that is absolutely fucking hilarious. Oh my god, and you have such a big heart. That literally made my day. It's such a cute story. If you would like to be a Rebel of the Week, please do send in your story. It can be any kind of rebellion, and I say this all the time, but we are always in need of rebel stories. You can email your story to Becca over on rebelauthorpodcast@gmail.com. 3 new patrons this week. Holy crap. Amazing. Thank you so much and welcome Samantha Reynolds, May Britt and Trish Gillam. A huge thank you to my existing patrons. If you would like to support the show and get early access to all the episodes as well as bonus content like the Slack community group where we chat and talk and help each other and support each other, the masterclasses of which our next one is sweet and spicy sex scenes, then you can do all of that by visiting patreon.com/Sasha Black. This week's episode is sponsored by Pro Writing Aid. Rather than me tell you all about why I love it, I'm going to let Kimberly Grimes tell you all about why she loves it. Now, Kimberly is an author of young adult fantasy, and she is also the creator of the 4-week story prep workbook. This is being run on Kickstarter, and as this episode airs, I believe there's only 3 days left for you to go and have a look. I have pledged, I'm a backer, and you get this wonderful, actually giant and very thick story prep workbook, and it is looking fantastic. It is basically to help you for a NaNoWriMo, I believe. But either way, anything that helps me brainstorm and outline my novels, the better. So yeah, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes for you to go and have a look at it. And it is also exquisitely, beautifully laid out and designed. So that's what I'm excited for, because I love me a bloody workbook. So go and check it out. And now over to Kimberly and Pro Writing Aid.
I've had Pro Writing Aid for years now and frequently use the web editor program to check what I've written in my emails and newsletters. When checking my stories, either directly in Microsoft Word through the add-in feature or in the web editor on the Pro Writing Aid website, Pro Writing Aid is my go-to resource for grammar and spelling checks. And as much as I love the grammar and spelling checks, that's only half of what their editing software can do. Some of my favorite tools Pro Writing Aid offers are the overused words, echo words, and sentence length features. I've recommended Pro Writing Aid to many of my author friends, as well as many of my friends and family who are not writers. Not only is this program a must-have, but it's also a sanity saver.
Hello and welcome to the Rebel Author podcast. Today I'm joined by Daniel Kraus. Daniel is a New York Times best-selling author with Guillermo del Toro. He wrote The Shape of Water based on the same idea Kraus and del Toro created for the Oscar-winning film, and Troll Hunters, adapted into the Emmy-winning Netflix series. Kraus followed his science thriller Wrath, co-authored with Sharon Maolem, I hope I pronounced that right, with the widely acclaimed USA Today bestseller Whaleful. His novel, The Death and Life of Zebulon Finch, was named one of Entertainment Weekly's top 10 books of the year, which has a cracking opening as well, because I did start reading that the other day. Hello and welcome.
Hi. What's up?
It's lovely to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me. Before we kind of dive into the work that you've done with George A. Romero and kind of the film and all the voice and kind of the really unique voices that you create in your work, I wondered if you could tell everyone a little bit about you and how you got to where you are today, because you have one hell of a career.
I mean, that's nice of you to say that. It's nice to think that on occasion. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, how does one start such a response? Uh, I mean, I started writing when I was a little kid, probably in like first grade, and never really stopped. There was a period, I would say, that began in college and kind of went through college and most of my 20s, where is the only time I really deviated from wanting to write books for a living, and I was involved in filmmaking for those years. And had a decent little run, but ultimately my tendencies are to, work alone more or less in the privacy of my home. I'm a bit of a hermit.
Spoken like every author ever.
yeah, I'm not surprised. So the turn to books was partially a lifestyle turn, but also a turn back to what I originally wanted to do as a kid. And yeah, so I wrote a book, at some point in came out in 2009, I think, my first book. And, got real lucky, sold my very first book to Random House. And then after that, I've just kept going. I really, really, really love writing. It's my favorite thing to do in the world. And it's hard to stop me from doing it every day. Every holiday at night, it's truly just my passion, and the publishing side of it is almost secondary. Like I would be certainly the J.D. Salinger type who would, even if it wasn't publishing, would just be writing regardless of publishing. It's kind of an obsession.
I love that. Do you read as much as you write, or like would you say you're a writer first then a reader?
I mean, there's no way I can read as much as I write because I write all day. So I'm definitely not reading all day. But I've been a heavy reader my whole life. I think a key to my reading and my movie watching and stuff like that is that it's very, very broad. Like I'll read anything, any genre. Same thing with movies I watch. Um, I don't watch a lot of TV because I'm not really interested so much in extended stories. It's why I don't really tend to read series novels either. Like I like
Interesting.
new new input constantly coming in that is very, very different from each other. So on any given, week of glancing at my letterboxd account, you'll see westerns, romances, old movies, new movies, horror, sci-fi, dramas, anything. And that carries over to my reading as well.
Amazing. Well, let's dive into the questions. I wondered if you can give listeners like a quick background on how your new novel, Pay the Piper, came about, because it's really interesting and not the way that most novels kind of come about. So, like, yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, it's not how most novels come about, thank God, because it was I think pound for pound the hardest book I've done. Like I say that pound for pound because I've written other books that are 800 pages and very complicated, and this book is nothing like that. But it was just hard because of how it was written. So I had been asked to finish George Romero's um, epic zombie novel, The Living Dead, several years ago. He had been working on it for years, and he died before it was finished. And Romero was my favorite artist of any sort since I was a kid. So that was a huge honor. And while I was finishing that book up and going through his archives, kind of looking for any other material that might help the finishing of that book, I came across another book. I came across a second book. And now that the archives have been thoroughly cataloged, as far as we know, there is no third book. This is kind of the end of the road. But that book was Pay the Piper, or more specifically, the first half of a book called Pay the Piper. So, unlike The Living Dead, which had pieces of writing that were intended for all throughout the film and included some notes to where some of the storylines were going, Pay the Piper included none of that stuff. It was just half a book that suddenly cuts off in the middle of a chapter. And that ended up being really, really challenging um, because I had to really investigate the manuscript that was there for clues to where George was going with some of the plot. And it was very difficult, but very satisfying to actually find a lot of those clues. Things that were strange or unusual in the book that I looked into and then found guideposts of where to head next.
So, was there no outline, no kind of notes for you?
Nope.
Oh, God.
No outline, no notes. No one had ever heard of this project. It seemed to be a completely secret project.
It's so cool. Okay, so let's I know I'm already off track, but I'd love to hear about those guideposts. Like as a writer, like so I deconstruct almost everything that I read. Every book I read, I scribble in, I write notes, I have sticky tabs because I'm always looking for something, structure, characterization, whatever. So I have a certain way of looking at story and looking at the written word, but I'd love to know, how did you do it? What were you looking for? What stuck out to you? Why did it stick out? What were the clues that you kind of picked out?
Well, I mean, there's many, but I can mention one or two. Um, I mean, the book is so peculiar. Like it's about this swamp entity of some sort in the Louisiana Bayou that's getting revenge on this community of this very, very small backwaters town. But the manuscript was just filled with really disparate, bizarre elements. Like there was the swamp monster, sure, but there was also a sheriff who was obsessed with John Wayne and weird Zydeco bands and um, pirates. Like a lot of it had to do with real life pirates Lafitte. Um, just so many strange elements all thrown together. And some of them were so emphasized in George's writing that they demanded to be studied more carefully. He had a character name that was just odd, and so I ended up looking up the character name and found that a different permutation of the name was actually the name of this kind of voodoo god, and that led me down a research hole where I realized, okay, some of what he's doing aligns with this. my favorite one is really uh, the book is really concerned with this one movie that John Wayne made called Wake of the Red Witch, and it's a pretty obscure movie. So it seemed very peculiar that Romero spent so much time talking about this movie. Uh, and I didn't know what to make of it, but I was just like, kind of like, oh, I guess I'll go with it. But then I started reading a couple biographies of John Wayne to see if there's any clues in there, because people just don't write much about this movie. And at the end of the second biography I read, uh, when John Wayne was dying of cancer, I I discovered that he called his own cancer the Red Witch, like he named it after the movie.
Oh my
And
God.
and then I realized that a lot of Pay the Piper was about cancer. Uh, so a lot of these exciting little connections that he must have all just had on the edge of his brain, but for me, I had to dive into it, and then piece by piece, things started fitting together. So at least I knew the full stakes he was setting up, and then it was up to me to tie them together by the end.
I mean, have you ever considered, like private investigation or like as a second career? Because that's fucking unbelievable. Like, but even to think to read a biography about John and then connect those. Yeah, I mean, you must. I don't even know what to say. I know it's incredible to like make those connections
Yeah,
and
it was really, there were a few like really brain bursting moments where you realize, oh, this is what he was doing. It would have been a lot easier if he had just left a few notes, but he didn't. So I had to spend months trying to figure it out.
are there any other process differences between when you normally write a novel sort of solo and sort of this process of having been given dumped a
Yeah,
half a manuscript on your table?
yeah. The big process difference is that being such a fan and kind of acolyte of Romero, I am very protective of his writing. Like I want to use as much of it as possible because it's finite. I can't just go to him and ask for more pages. So with Pay the Piper and with The Living Dead 2, I would really try to make what he wrote work, even if it didn't work in the way he thought it was going to work. Like maybe there's a chapter that just doesn't function correctly, but maybe it can be used later on, or maybe the action in it can be attributed to a different character, or maybe I can combine two characters. Um, so the process would involve a lot of tricks and more strenuous efforts to somehow use what was there, even if it was in a different way. So that's just very different. Like normally you're just creating and deleting willy nilly whenever you want to. This was working on both the Romero manuscripts were a much more complicated process of writing and synthesizing and restoring in a way, like almost like you would restore an old painting or a
Yeah.
mosaic or something. Like I was cleaning up and trying to bring this into shape without ruining the original um, textures.
Yeah. So obviously this is a co-authored project. One of the things, so I've got a couple of friends who are ghostwriters. And so there's a very different role. But one thing that they do is they try to capture voice. So the voice of the person that they're working with. So how did you I mean, yeah, like how did you blend or how did you work with, obviously his work is very precious to you. So I'm sure there was a lot of thought that went into that kind of merging or mimicking, or I don't know what the right word is to ask you to kind of describe that process of creating that joint voice.
Yeah, the voice was a big deal. And that's why this is not a ghost written piece. Like a ghost writing exactly is what you're saying. You're trying to capture someone else's voice and writing it as if they were writing it. These books are very much collaborations. First of all, there just wasn't enough of them to do anything but fully collaborate on them. And so I have my voice as a writer, and I think Ramiro has his. And what both The Living Dead and Pay the Piper have is a kind of a third voice that developed as I was working. So as I was revising and tweaking, and in some instances changing a little bit of what he wrote, a third voice would have developed. Like, this is what Romero's text looks like when filtered through me. And then I would use that voice to continue with the stuff that wasn't there. So it's somewhat organic. It would just kind of, the voice would present itself when I was working with his pages.
What do you feel like? So you've done this twice now. What do you feel are the biggest lessons you've learned? Maybe about craft or about collaboration? Because obviously I'm going to ask you that question because obviously you've co-authored with Sharon as well. So like, yeah, what are kind of your biggest lessons about kind of collaboration or even the craft of working with George's work?
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to take them separately because every collaboration I've learned is they just almost have no similarity to one another. Like, every time you work with someone else, it's so different, which is part of why I do it, because it forces me to work outside my comfort zone and do things I wouldn't normally do. Um, the hardest of all the collaborations I've done have definitely been the Romero manuscripts, because there's the collaborator's not there, and so I'm taking on the weight of not just a collaborator, but of someone trying to maintain the voice of the other collaborator without being able to, request new or revised materials. Um, and there's not like a Romero committee out there who's going to judge it, my work officially. So I have to be the steward of that, of what he left. But at the end of the day, it is a collaboration. Both of our names are on the front for a reason, and it is, in a way, it's these two books are always going to be my interpretation of George's two unfinished novels. Um, one could go to his archives and look at his original manuscripts if you wanted, to see his original unfinished version. So, it's like when book gets turned into a movie, and even if you don't like the movie, the book is still there. Um, so, Romero's original manuscripts have not been incinerated. They're out there somewhere. These are kind of my takes on them, and I'm delighted that the estate has trusted me with them. And just there's nothing really else in my career that makes me want to pinch myself as much as the Romero stuff, because he was so important to me and continues to be so important to me as an artist. So to be able to be a part of these projects, even if they're ultimately footnotes on his film career, uh, it's it's really exciting and gratifying to me.
So what do you feel are the biggest differences between working with a collaborator who's kind of not there to talk to versus working with Sharon, who I'm assuming is still here?
Yeah, it's like, when you're working with Sharon or Guillermo or anyone else who I might collaborate with, there are two living forces, and part of the collaboration process is some element of friction. Like, there's there are two people who do things different ways, and so there's going to be, um, fights are is too much of a word, because usually these are congenial conversations between people, but there are two different viewpoints coming out the same story. So that creates problems, but also opportunities to kind of reinvent ways of thinking, which is really exciting to me. And regardless if I'm collaborating or not, every book I do, I try to do something that I've never done before, so I can't fall back on my old tricks. Which is why I do so many different mediums and genres, age ranges, and stuff. Uh, and that's good. It's almost like you're boxing someone in a good-natured way. Like, they have ideas, you have ideas, and you're sort of hitting it out. Um, Not having that other person there and just having a property means, in a way, you have to box yourself, which is weird. Like, you have to be on both sides and say, here's what Dan wants to do, but you're like, well, what if George wanted to do as well? So it's a very strange battle where you have to almost bisect yourself in a way and be able to represent both sides at once.
When kind of taking this raw draft that he had, or half the draft, how do you connect with character, because I feel like characters are so unique to each author, and like, okay, they're not real people, but I mean, when you spend a really long time with these made up fictional characters, they definitely feel real. And I don't know if I would know how to take somebody else's, like, fan fiction I find fascinating, because I don't know how I would do that, because I don't know the characters. So how did you take those characters and, I don't know, for want of a better word, get to know them, or like,
Yeah.
make them your own, or but collaboratively, if that makes sense?
I think it was a lot tougher in this one than it was The Living Dead, just because the characters here were so different, so unique. Um, it's such a strange collection, like the group of survivors, I guess, who sort of band together in this book. They're just all so unique and specific and unusual, and almost none of whom I would have come up with on my own. Like there were some characters in Living Dead that felt like, okay, this character reminds me of something I might do. But the characters in Pay the Piper were so much pulled from things that Romero liked and kind of icons he liked, that yeah, part of it was stumbling around in their voices and stories for a while and finding facets to them that I got excited about and could respond to. Um, and some characters it was easier than others, but at some point I could connect with all of them. But yeah, it was hard. It was hard. Um, yeah, it was hard. I just keep repeating that. It that second half of the book was something that I wrote and rewrote in major ways. Like I would, go back and kind of gut the whole thing and say this something here isn't right. Um, things aren't coming together as they should. Um, I need to think back on the first half of the book again and find a way that makes sense. And eventually it did. Like eventually I had those eureka moments where I was like, yes, this fits into this. If I add this element, that makes this other element make more sense. And um, yeah, it was a lot.
How do you, this is like a wild card question, but like, how do you cope with the psychological pressure of what you've had to do? Because obviously George is very, very well known. And it's like you've already mentioned, it was a huge honor. I don't know about you, but I would put an unbelievable amount of pressure on myself to deliver something that I felt was right, or whatever psychological nonsense I would come up with in my own brain.
Yeah.
Yeah, did you, like, were there any mindset things that you had to, like, maybe talk out, or like, how do you cope with such a big, it was a bloody huge job, how do you cope with that?
Yeah, it was hard. But to me, the writing of any novel involves faking myself out that I've totally got it.
Yeah.
That I'm the guy to do it. I've got this thing by the balls, as they say. Like I know what I'm doing. And for the first Romero book, as daunting as it was, I also just told myself I've been training for this my whole life. I've been studying his movies since I was 5 years old. Um, and so during the writing process, anyway, that first draft, I just have to sort of fake it, and I do that pretty well. Just you know, go into it like with as much confidence as I can. There can't really be any waffling or worrying at that stage. I've just got to rage through it like I've totally got control of it. Um, and then when the book is done, and particularly really when it gets close to coming out, that's when any of the doubts will start seeping in. But at that point, I've moved on to three other projects, so I've got limited brain space to devote to worrying because I just got too many things going on. Pay the Piper was because I'd gone through The Living Dead. The Pay the Piper wasn't as difficult. Like I felt confident that I could do it, more confident even than the first book. Um, and that was a good thing that I felt that way, because it was a project that at several points could have just made me quit because it was just so damn difficult.
Okay, so let's talk about the swamp monster. How do you create authentic monsters that kind of feel real and scary without being cliched? Like any advice for kind of newer writers who want to create those kind of horror-like monster elements in their work?
I mean, it's hard to give advice on that. I know me personally, I've really tried to avoid um, classic monsters. The one big exception, of course, is zombies with the Living Dead. But in that case, I was co-writing with Romero, who invented zombies. Our modern idea of zombies. So that was a big exception that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, generally, I'm not writing books like I'm not writing werewolf books and vampire books like those. That has less appeal to me. I want to write new things and come up with new ideas. Um, and so Pay the Piper fit right in because it was just this new thing. He had sort of half created this force in the swamp that was part monster and part god. There was something cosmic to it, but something very visceral too. And it was somehow plugged into actual events in Louisiana history. Um, and I don't write that much stuff that's really fully supernatural. Most of my stuff, even my stuff that people would call horror, is the horror of other people, more or less. Um, so I don't write a lot of supernatural stuff really, and this was fully supernatural in parts, and so that was something new for me, something newish that was fun to play around with. Um, yeah, so I mean, as far as advice goes, that's all I can say is just try to you know push yourself into something new. But then again, I have unique, as does everyone, sort of unique predilections and preferences. There are lots of people out there who are like, "Ooh, a new werewolf book," and that's what they want. You probably would do well just writing revamps of sort of classic characters. For whatever reason, that doesn't excite me as much. But I think that's also what excited Romero about Pay the Piper. Like you could really tell, as good as some of his writing was on The Living Dead, his manuscript for the Pay the Piper was just his joy of writing it was just leaping off the page because it had nothing to do with zombies, and he felt so kind of pinned in by zombies. Um, you could just see him having a ball with this other book, Pay the Piper, which is just filled with all the kind of stuff he really liked.
So in there, you mentioned in your other work that people class as horror. It's really about other people's horror. Can you go into a little bit more about that and how, like, any craft tips for creating that?
I mean, generally, I'm really bad at craft tips, um, so it's hard. It's hard for me to give craft tips. I don't know
Talk
why.
about how in talking about how you create it, like, and put it on the
Uh-huh.
page, that is craft. Like, it is, I think that's craft tips.
Well, um, I don't know. For some reason, I've always bent towards realism. Um, there's, and there was some of this in kind of wrestling with the Pay the Piper manuscript. Of once you go into the supernatural, the possibilities are just so endless that um, I feel a little untethered. Like if here's this being that can sort of manifest in different ways, well, I mean, there's a millions of ways I could write that, and I really like writing with limits. Like I really like. I find that if I give the fewer options I give myself, the more creative I have to be to work inside of them. So to use an extreme example, like if you were to write a book that all took place in one room, for example, like you're really limiting your options. And so you're going to be forced to be, I think, especially creative because you've boxed yourself in. I've written books that don't use standard punctuation or that all take place in real time or a number of other problems that I purposely create for myself to force myself um, to be rigorous in the writing. Uh, I tend to do a lot of research, so part of my interest in realism is just I really like the feeling of having done the hard work. Like and you can sitting down and just writing a book off the cuff is one thing, but knowing that you took the time to put the months of research or interviews or whatever you needed to do to make sure it feels accurate and is accurate to the extent that a novel needs to be, and reflects, particularly when you're writing, as I do in Pay the Piper, about some real events, reflects those events accurately. Um, that's all very important to me, and is stuff that I respond to as a reader. Like I love reading a book and getting the sense that au- the author has worked hard and done their job.
I think there's a lot of writers who love to do one of two things, learn and input. But I also think we can like use that as an excuse to then not get to the page. How do you kind of get to that saturation point, or how do you know when the right time, like when is enough enough? Because like a lot of us would research until the end rather than actually getting the words on the page.
Yeah, I've done that once. There's one project that I still hope to get to one day where I got lost in the research, and I've got a huge bin over yonder over there that's just filled with 100 books that I read and just became overwhelmed with. So I've that was a big learning moment for me, that I can get lost in research, and then be sort of paralyzed because I sort of at that moment know too much and can't select the important pieces. So yeah, when and how much I research is a really important element. Like sometimes I'll write a little bit of the book to make sure that I like it enough to want to research. Um, sometimes I very often will research enough to get me started and then pause along the way as more research is needed. Sometimes you need to front load. Like when I did whale fall, I didn't know anything about whales, so obviously I needed to learn everything about the inside of a whale to even begin to plot it because I don't know what's possible. For something like Pay the Piper, takes place more or less in our recognizable real world, so I'm able to get a certain amount into it before I have to worry about you know what exact plants grow down here, what does it smell like, what are these historical events. um, so yeah, I think that is a craft tip. I don't know how to express it necessarily, but knowing when to research and when to stop researching or pause researching is really important.
Um, okay, let's talk to like the new writers. Obviously, you research a lot, you read a lot, you watch a lot of movies. What kind of mistakes do you see newer writers in their kind of horror arena making? What do you feel like are some signs of, I guess, newer
Mm.
writing?
Well, I think there can be a reliance, as I said, on already established sort of monster icons. You know, now if you're a good enough writer, you can make anything. Um, but as sort of the first step of being interested in a book, if it's a book about if it's the 10 millionth book about werewolves or vampires or something, it's going to have a tougher time getting my attention. I'm just not personally. Uh, Redos of those things just don't excite me as much. What I always want from a book is I always want to be really surprised, and that has on every level. Like I want the topic to be surprising, but I also want the sentences to be surprising. I'll take a book about paint drying if the sentences are good over a perfectly plotted book that's just sort of okay in its prose writing. The style is everything to me, and that And that's not the case, I think, with most readers. Most readers, the story is the most important thing. So I know in that way I'm a little unusual. Um, your question, though, getting back to your question, was about horror writers, new writers, like maybe mistakes they make or something they could improve. Um, Again, I really want to feel the work put into it, but I also know that in my first book, I didn't do that either. I just sat down and wrote a book kind of that was based in the things that I already knew. And so, you have to bite off what you can chew. So it makes sense that a newer writer would, not want to load, 50 books they need to read and interviews they need to take while they're still working on figuring out how to write a book. Um,
One of the things that
and
I think's devastating, but also a truism, is that I think books can illuminate things about the author, like the real person behind the words, because by the very nature of how a book is created, it is literally taken from our brain. And obviously you've mentioned like how much you had to get to know the manuscript, or the half manuscript that you had. And you've done that twice now. So I guess, did you feel like, what did you learn about George, the person, or I guess the writer, more rather than necessarily just the story? Did you learn anything about him? Like, what did his words kind of illuminate to you as somebody who got to deconstruct them in a much more intimate way than probably your average
yeah,
reader?
yeah, what I learned about him through working on this material is reflected in what you learn by going through his archives, which are at the University of Pittsburgh. And you really see someone who had a limited interest in horror. Like that's where he started, but that was not what he intended to be and never really wanted to be. And I think that's part of what made him such a great horror filmmaker, is that his interest was not really ever in scaring you. He only made a couple of movies I think were trying to scare you. Romero's movies, as celebrated as they are, generally aren't very scary. Um, he he wanted to do other things and then was forced to do those things through a horror lens, which I think made them unique. Um, so I learned that more. Like you could see his passion of writing character material was much higher than it was writing the horror stuff. Um, he just got really fired up. He'd go down these rabbit holes of character stuff, which were just fascinating. And I think that's what appealed to him about books in general, is that he was a screenwriter. And a screenwriter, you got whatever 100 pages, and things have to move in a certain, not exact 3-act format, but they have to satisfy what the producers want for their audiences. He saw books as a way to kind of go wild, and that's both good and bad in his manuscripts. Like the good part is that he is just letting himself run. He's like running like he's on down the street on fire. Like he's just writing like mad. The negative side of that is that because I think these books aren't finished because he would continue to add stuff. Like if you think of a book as a kind of triangle that's opening wider and wider and wider, that's how he would write. He would just like keep adding more characters, more events, more stuff. And then I think what would happen is at some point he'd realize he had so much and didn't know how to, because he didn't write with a plan, didn't know what to do with all of it, which made my job years later much harder because I'm the one who has to kind of go through it and say, all right, how do I corral this stuff back into some sort of manageable storyline?
Amazing. Um, okay, one last question before I ask you the ultimate podcast question. So I don't know the extent to which you were kind of involved in the movie stuff. But obviously you've mentioned that you kind of worked in different mediums. and also you do a lot of movie watching. So what have you taken from those other mediums and brought back into your novel writing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like most of my inspiration for books doesn't come from other books. I feel like it comes more from uh, movies, and usually movies that have nothing to do with the genre that I'm writing. Like that's the stuff that's most surprising and interesting to me. Is I could be watching a comedy and something in it will trip a trigger. Like, oh, that'd be perfect in my science fiction novel. There's the more cross the wires get, the more exciting it is to me. I write 100% with music, usually pretty loud. That doesn't mean the music itself is aggressive. Sometimes it is, but just so music informs my writing a lot. Sometimes I'll listen to music that either reflects the mood or counterpoints the mood intentionally, to create kind of a tension. Um, yeah, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that excites me. Just to have this kind of open filter in my brain that is always in a kind of latent way scanning for material to the point where I don't even really realize it, but then it'll snag on the filter and I'll write it down. And that's how the books get born.
Amazing. Well, this is the Rebel Author podcast. So tell everyone about a time you unleashed your inner rebel.
See, this is where it would have been good had I known. I paid attention and known this question was coming. Time that I
Everybody
unleashed
gets,
my
everyone
inner
gets tripped
rebel, huh?
up. Don't worry.
Um, I don't know. I feel like taking quitting one's like standard job, career, and working in the arts full time is a kind of rebellious act. Um, at some point I had to do that and just like throw caution to the wind and say, all right, I'm just going to try to do this. Um, which is very, very hard. I think I can't remember the exact stat. I think it was 4%. I think it was 4% of writers can make a decent living writing. So the odds are really, really against you. And it's so far it's worked out. But I I probably should take more moments to appreciate that. I'm always charging ahead with so many projects that I don't acknowledge um, the success and the luck. There's always luck involved of having been able to do this and continue to be able to do this. I think that's some ways that's the ultimate sort of rebel move, is to say I'm just going to do something alone, particularly if you're someone who has no connections. Grew up, I mean, I grew up in small town Iowa. I didn't know anyone who knew anyone who knew anyone who had any life in the arts. So um in pre-internet times, like there was no sense one could ever do something like this for a living. So questions like this are a good moment for me to sort of think back and realize that, yeah, things, rebellious risks don't always work. They really don't, but sometimes they do.
I still remember the day I quit my job. It was the best day of my life. Also, the most terrifying thing I've ever done in my life.
Hmm.
But
It is scary.
it
Are
is. It's
you, are
terrifying.
you, despite your accent, are you in the US?
No, no, I'm UK. Yeah, I'm very
Okay.
British.
Well, in the US, it's especially fraught because you lose your health care.
Right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you
We are
don't,
very lucky here.
I mean, it's something that can't be um, mentioned enough of how dramatic and how screwed up that is. But like healthcare is through your work, and so
Mm,
if you quit your job, you quit your healthcare, um, and so you're really out on a limb.
mm.
The risks are really dramatic. You're risking your life and your livelihood and your health. So and that of your family if you have a family. So it's it's a difficult decision for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, would you like to tell everyone where they can find out more about you, your books, and anything else you'd like to add?
Well, danielkraus.com is really the place. It'll link to anywhere else that you can find me. There's a link there for my newsletter, which is really the best place to get information as I'm using social media more frequently. Um, yeah, I don't know.
Perfect.
That's the best spot, I guess.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And of course, a big thank you to all of the show's listeners and all of the show's patrons. If you would like to get early access to all of the episodes, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/Sasha Black. I'm Sasha Black. You were listening to Daniel Kraus, and this was the Rebel Author Podcast. Next week, I'm joined by Danny Abernathy, and we're talking all about world building and finding the you in your story. So join me next week for that. Don't forget to tune in and subscribe on your podcatcher. And when you have a moment, please leave a review.